It's recorded. As you remember, so 2 weeks ago, I gave a lecture on CMC theories, and we didn't really make it through, of course. So we ended up with like halfway. So we discussed social presence, we discussed media richness theory, and there is electronic ubiquity and channel expansion, but they are not that interesting, so I think I might as well skip them for time purposes. So let's continue with the other theories I want to discuss that are pretty important for social media and communication in general, and also very important for virtual teams. So we start with SIDE. SIDE is the social identity model of deindividuation effects. So last week we ended with discussing theories which are mostly presence-related theories. So all the theories we discussed last week, social presence and related ones, and richness, are theories that basically say, well, it is always worse to communicate with computer-mediated communication than face-to-face. So it may help in equality, for example, but if you want to communicate rich emotional communication, if you want to have if you want to form a relationship with people and don't see them as computers but as real persons, then you need face-to-face communication. So most of the theories argue that, and still up to this day, how we think of computer-mediated communication in general is based on these theories. So like a face-to-face is a kind of holy grail to try to attain using computer-mediated communication. However, in science, we have progressed a bit, a lot actually, and we started to investigate the cases in which you see that computer-mediated communication can be just as good or even better in terms of, for example, intimacy and relationship formation and the ability to communicate than face-to-face communication. Because again, it seems obvious, face-to-face is where we have all the cues, it's quick, we can see each other, so that's the best way to communicate. But still, if you see what we do with social media, in and outside of the workplace, you see that it's very rich. We have for relationships on Tinder, we have very rich emotional conversation using WhatsApp. And many of your theories cannot really explain that. Well, SIDE was one of the first theories that explained how computer-mediated communication could be just as intimate or just as social as face-to-face communication. And they developed the theory because they noticed that what many people observed as non-normative behavior was actually not really non-normative. So if you think of a Reddit or YouTube comment section, and if you look at it from the outside, then it may look like it's flaming, and it may look non-normative. But if you're in there from the inside, if you're part of the community, it's actually kind of normative behavior. I don't know how many of you play games, multiplayer games, but if you play multiplayer games like Call of Duty and related types of games, you don't say to each other, could you please go there? Or could you please keep out from me? No, you yell and you curse and you explain what you will do to someone else's mother. Because that's yes, like that. So so you do things like that because they are part of what you are supposed to be doing in these games. So it's actually kind of normative behavior. It's just what happens within that community. So that's what SIDE theory noticed, and they said, well, maybe it's not as non-normative as people think, but maybe actually computer-mediated communication is very normative. Maybe there is like a sense of community. It's just a different sense of community for what we experience elsewhere. The theory is built upon computer-mediated communication, but actually has also been built up from theories about social identity and group formation. So one inspiration for the theory was how hooligans behave. And if you look at football hooligans, it's very non-normative behavior. It looks a lot like what people do in a YouTube comment section. So they just destroy things and fight with each other. But actually, a lot of people have studied hooligan behavior and even like undercover as part of the hooligan group. And actually, what they're doing is very normative. And actually, most of those people who are hooligans are, they're house fathers, and they're actually pretty nice people. But once they're in the group, they adopt the identity of that group, and they start behaving differently from what they would normally do, but still as part of that social identity, as part of the hooligan group. And that's what you also see in online. So side theory says, well, okay, we kind of observe normlessness, but actually it's more pro-social than antisocial behavior. There's a very fun YouTube video about a game show that shows deindividuation effects and social identity effects in a game show setting, but it takes 42 minutes, so that's not something that I can show you in this lecture. But it's very fun to watch. And let me explain the theory. So the theory says, well, if you communicate with other people using computer-mediated communication, there is some kind of deindividuation. So you cannot directly see the other people. You have less information of the other people. So, for example, I cannot see you now because you have not turned on your webcam, but I do have your names, and I do know that you're part of the group who studies communication information science, and that you do take this course. So I do have some information, but there is some kind of deindividuation going on. And Side argues, well, because we have less information available when we talk to each other online, we pay more attention to situational cues. So, simple example is, if I put all of you or some of you in a group, you don't know each other, you're completely anonymous to each other, but the only thing you know is that you all take social media at work, then that is a situational cue. So that gives you information about the people in the group. You don't know a lot about the people, but you do know that they all take social media at work. And the theory then argues on, well, this anonymity does not lead to normlessness, but it leads you to adopting the identity of the group. And that part is based on social identity theory. And social identity theory argues that we have both a personal identity as well as social identities. So I am Alex, but I am also part of my family. I have a friend group. I am a fan of certain sports teams. I feel part of the teacher community in our communication information science program. So I have a lot of different social groups that I belong to. And with each of those social groups belongs a kind of identity. So I know how to behave in my social identity as a teacher towards students. So when we are among teachers ourselves or without students, I have a different social identity and I behave differently. With my friends, I still behave differently. So there is a social identity, so norms that guide my behavior, that for each group. And the theory even goes so far in saying that, well, if you adopt a social identity, that becomes kind of who you are at that moment. So you kind of become a member of that group, and your personal identity shifts a bit to the background. So just think about how you are when you are among friends and when you have consumed a bit of alcohol. Suddenly you start behaving as part of the group, and less, maybe a bit less, as who you are, who you personally are. So your social identity becomes a bit the real you. And that's what we observe not only in computer-mediated communication, but everywhere. And that's actually a very strong psychological effect. We just want to belong to groups. So if I would, split you in half and would say to the half of you, you are group red, and to the other half of you, you are group blue, you would automatically create a kind of a group identity and would compete against the other group, because you as group red think you are better than group blue, and you want to make sure that your group performs better and is like a better and nicer and more social group than group blue. And that's something we inherently have as people. So we want to belong to groups, and we want to say, well, I am this group, and this is the outside group, and my group is better than the outside group. It's just something that's built in us, or something genetic. So we have a very strong tendency to divide people into groups, like our group, other groups. So if you combine the anonymity part and the social identity part, you may get a situation in which you feel more part of the group than you would normally feel in real life. Because if you are in a group that's relatively anonymous, and the only thing you know of the people in that group is that they are also students taking the course Social Media at Work, that makes you feel like extra part of the group. And it also makes you project the stereotypes of that group onto the other people in the group. So you don't know much about the other people in the group. The only thing you do know is that they take the same course of you, so they must be similar to you. They must be likable. You must be able to get along with them. And that effect becomes even stronger if you know that there is an outside group who, for example, takes another course. So if you're anonymous and you know that the people in your group take this course, and that there is another group who takes another course, then you really get those. Then you really get competitive. So you really feel part of your group, and you really want to be better than an outside group. And psi theory says, well, this effect, is group effect, inside-outside group, and that social identity that you have within the group is stronger when you are relatively anonymous, because there's just nothing else to focus on. So if I would put people in a group who are not anonymous, so for example with video conferencing or face-to-face, you would still observe some of these effects, but less strongly, simply because you have more information. Okay, that person is part of the group, but he is also ugly, and he wears clothes that I don't like, and he is bald or something like that. So that gives you a lot of other information to also base your opinion on. So formally, if you're relatively anonymous or you have less information about the other, then you become a bit depersonalized. So that's the deindividuation part. If then there is an available cue to a shared social identity. So for example, we're all group blue, we all take the course Social Media at Work. So there's a cue to a shared identity. That identity becomes important, more important than if you would be face-to-face. And that results in you focusing on similarities between the group, that you will feel part of your group, that you will have that you form stereotypes about your group members, but also negative stereotypes about people in other groups, etc. And this is, well, this has been observed, a lot. So in many different experiments based on sight, they just divide people into groups, and they give some groups cues to identity, other cues no cues to identity, and they see what happens when they communicate. And you often observe these effects. So is everyone sensitive to this? Well, yes, everyone is sensitive to this, but not to the same extent. Of course, some people are more individualized than others. So some people have are more individual as a trait than others. It's also culturally based. So in our Western culture, we are generally more individualistic than collectivistic, and in more Eastern cultures, it's more collectivistic. But still, everyone is sensitive to this. So you all feel part. There's no one who says, "Well, I'm only individual and part of no group." And it's quite strong. So the social identity theory itself, so without the anonymity part, has been proven like many times. And for example, the famous experiments like the Stanford prison experiment is also an experiment in social identity. So they just put people into different groups. They said to a random sample of individuals, you are prisoners, to another random sample, you are prison guards, and then suddenly people start behaving as if they are prisoners or prison guards. And of course, some people are more sensitive than others. Some people like to be in a certain group, but still, it's a very strong effect of feeling part of a group. I myself, so this is an example of something else, but maybe it's a bit more fun to give an example of a study that I actually did for my master thesis a long time ago. And what we did was we divided people into groups, and they had to communicate with another group. We divided people into groups and to communicate with their group. And we had a 2x2 design. So in one manipulation was that they were either anonymous, so they had to talk through text-based chat. So similarly as you do with me, so we talk through text-based chat. While the other groups were not anonymous, and they talked using video conferencing, or actually video conferencing, you saw a picture of the people you were communicating with, just a photo. So like you see me, of them non-moving. So that was one manipulation. The other one was that you either were in a group that you identified with, or in a group that you did not identify with. So at the time, I was studying at the University of Amsterdam. So we just said you're in a group of people who studies communication at the University of Amsterdam, or you're in a group of people from the Free University. And the Free University, people from the Free University dislike the people from the University of Amsterdam, and the other way around. And what you immediately observed was that when you were anonymous, so you had to chat with people only in text-based chat, and you thought that people were from your own university, the people would immediately like each other. So they could accomplish the task fairly quickly. They liked each other. There was quick consensus of how to do the task. On the other hand, if they were anonymous and they thought that they would have to communicate with people from the Free University Amsterdam, they could not get along very well. So so there was no group formation, there was no social identity. But if people were identified, if they could see a photo of the other, the effects canceled. So there was no effect, and it was even a bit the other way around. And that's because now you could see the other person. So before, the only information you had was, okay, that's someone from my university, so that person must be like me. I like him. But now you see, okay, that person may be from another university, but I also see that he or she is a student, and I see what he or she looks like, so I have more information. And that kind of makes it happen, makes it so that the social identity is not that important anymore. And people suddenly realize, okay, that person is actually a real person. It's also a student. So that whole group thing is less important because you have all those individual cues. And that's what we have observed many times in those social identity studies. And the interesting thing is that you can use this in virtual teams. So you can use this in setting up social media and computer-mediated communication in an organization. So you can use this strategically as well. So it may even be better, and I think it actually is, if you have a virtual team, to first have a meeting with webcams off. To first have a meeting in which you only pay attention to, okay, you're part of a virtual team for this organization, this is your project. So explain to people what is similar, so try to create a social identity, and only then in the next meetings, start introducing people personally, because then you start creating a social identity. And that is really effective in helping people get along. On the other hand, it can also have adverse effects, because if you get along well in a group and everyone thinks they're friends and you have a strong social identity, it also results in disliking other groups. So in an organization, you might be able to get along very well with your own virtual team, but you refuse to share anything with other teams because there is an us versus them. So psi theory says that if you have a salient social identity, which means there is an identity present in an anonymous situation, that you get greater in-group identification and attraction, which may be positive for your virtual teams, but you also get greater stereotyping and rejection of the outgroup. So it's a very interesting theory, and if you do this in the lab, then the effects are very strong. But of course, nowadays, you see that computer-mediated communication is increasingly individuated. So the theory is from the 90s, and when you were online in the 90s, you were 90% of the time anonymous. So you would use a nickname, and there was no webcam, etc. But nowadays, you can see me. My name is below my video stream. So computer-mediated communication is increasingly individuated. So it's psi theory is not as relevant as it used to be, because there's more situations in which you just have more information about the people you're talking with. On the other hand, you see that in some sections of social media and then online communication, like anonymous comments, comment sections, ID boxes, and ID generating sessions in organizations where people are relatively anonymous, you still see these effects. And we will see next week, when we talk about enterprise social media and knowledge sharing, we will see that creating an identity can actually help knowledge sharing. Okay, so that is psi theory. Next one, social information processing. This one is actually extremely simple to explain, and maybe you have heard of this one before. Social information processing theory, it's already quite old, but it's still, I think, the most influential theory in computer-mediated communication. And it's actually pretty simple. So the theory argues that, okay, social presence theory, they are right, and it has less bandwidth. so you can communicate. So you're not able to communicate non-verbal information as efficiently as you would face to face. But therefore, it simply will take longer to develop intimate relationships. So because if you don't have non-verbal information, you miss certain bandwidth. So it will take longer to communicate the information you would otherwise communicate with other channels, or quicker, or whatever. So social information processing theory says, well, indeed, CMC has less cues than face-to-face, therefore it takes a bit longer. But they also argue that, okay, those social presence theories actually are quite pessimistic. Those social presence theories, they basically argue if we don't have information about someone else, we are not going to look for it. So we just start flaming and assume they are anonymous and not real people. Social information processing theory, on the other hand, says, well, no, that's not it. People are motivated to get to know one another, especially if people have never met before. There are only very few people who are actually, who don't want to get to know others and who have an initial disliking toward others. So most people, when they get to know other people, are motivated to get to know people and are motivated to be liked. So they say, well, people don't simply stop processing information if they're anonymous. So they want to reduce uncertainty. They want to form impressions of each other. They want to develop affinity. So they want to like each other, or at least determine if they can like each other. And that's why they try to squeeze as much out of the communication as possible. They just communicate longer. They pay more attention to the cues that are available, etc. So basically, that means that people adapt their interpersonal communication to whatever cues remain on computer-mediated communication. And that basically means, you use emojis to communicate information. So that smaller pictures you see here, I think that's still my Google profile picture. And I had a student that once said, wow, well, that's a face palm. So you've used that picture to try to show that you're tired of our students. And of course, you have the WhatsApp, I forgot the words, vinkjes, marks, help me. But you basically use every information that you have to try to form impressions. So it means we use linguistic cues, but we also use emojis. We use certain visual cues if they are available. We use chronemics, which is basically the time that someone takes to reply. So for example, if you chat with someone using WhatsApp, and then you of course see at the top, you see blah 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 is typing, and then you will attach much value to the extent of time it takes. Well, nothing is more irritating than if you see that someone is typing and no message arrives. And then you start to think about, okay, what may be going on here? Does he or she doesn't like me, or is it something I said, or whatever? So basically, because you have less information available, so because you cannot see the other person, you pay a lot of attention to those smaller cues. So for example, if you see that someone has read the message or read a WhatsApp message, but hasn't replied, then you also start thinking about what may be the cause of this. So in sum, people adapt their interpersonal communication to whatever cues are available in computer-mediated communication. So they use text-based chat such as this. So hi, they use this. They use chronemics. They use emojis. They use visual communication, or old-fashioned emoticons like this one. Thanks, Anik. And you also see that people develop alternative strategies than you use face-to-face. So, for example, in the study we did, we had people interact, people who did not know each other interact for the first time, and they either had to do that face-to-face or using text-based chat. And it was always one man, one woman. And they didn't know each other before, and they had to get to know each other, and they were free to chat about everything they wanted. And their only instructions was get to know each other. And then when you observe that face-to-face, you have a lot of information available. So it resulted that people asked fewer questions, and people did not disclose that much information. On the other hand, when people were using text-based chat, there was not much else they could do. So they had to ask questions to each other. So they had to disclose information. Oh, hi, what do you look like? How old are you? Etc. And that resulted in that people liked each other much more when they interacted using text-based chat, simply because they asked more questions and they self-disclosed more. And that is also because you have less information. So people were more motivated to find out who they're talking with, and as a result, adapted their normal conversation strategy to fit computer-mediated communication by simply asking more questions and telling more about themselves. So that's social information processing in a nutshell. And let's see if I have time for this. Yeah, well, let me first continue with the with hyperpersonal, and then I get back to the examples. So in short, social information processing is still very important. So it's still, there's a lot of research done. Okay, what happens if you have some information about someone but not other information? How do people form impressions of each other? How do they adapt their communication in order to find out about other people? And this is still a very active area of research, especially in social media. So, for example, if you apply for a job, you can be 100% sure that before someone invites you to an interview, they will Google you. So they will find your LinkedIn page and maybe other information of you online. And people do that because they want to form a first impression. Also, when you use, not in a work-related setting, but when you use Tinder, you have some information available. You have those photos, that's your bio. And then if you like each other, you start chatting. But then, you want to, you pay attention to the cues you have, and you try to adapt your communication in order to find out enough information in order to know if you want to take it a step further. And that can basically all be explained by social information processing, and especially the study of which cues are useful, are used in which online situations, and how do they affect how people communicate, is something that is still a very active area of research. On the other hand, some criticism is that you do observe that it's not always the case that people need time to get to know each other. So it's not always the case that it's slower to develop relationships. So, um, um, so for example, in work-related settings, so there was an experiment in which they, on the one hand, had people work together, but did not say how long they had to work together. And on the other hand, they told other groups, okay, you have to work together for 6-7 weeks or so. And then you see that people like immediately adopt their communication. So when people expect it's only a one-time group, the communication stays impersonal because people think, okay, I will talk to them for like 30 minutes and then it's done. There was no need to get to know each other. But if people expect they will have to work together for longer, immediately people get more personal. So it not always takes more time. People just vary in, so the situation sometimes varies, and people vary in the motivation to get to know each other. So those contingency factors, or those other factors, really strongly affect the amount of effort people are willing to put into developing a relationship based via computer-mediated communication, and also very much influence the way or the extent to which teams and organizations want to work together. And finally, and that's the step up to the last theory I want to discuss, is that you also observe actually many times that impressions that people form face-to-face go beyond the impressions that, impressions that people form using computer-mediated communication go beyond impressions that people form face-to-face. So for example, the example I just gave of our own research is that when people met each other for the first time using computer-mediated communication, they liked each other more than when they used face-to-face communication. So we observed that people liked each other more using computer-mediated communication than face-to-face. So sometimes impressions are better, or at least exaggerated when people use computer-mediated communication. And that is the final theory, that's hyperpersonal communication. And that theory explains why relationships or why group communication may sometimes be more intimate or more, satisfactory or whatever than offline relationships and face-to-face interactions. And hyperpersonal communication theory, which is also by Walther, explains like 4 sets of effects that contribute to these, what he calls hyperpersonal effects. So relationships that are more intimate than online than offline. And those sets of effects relate to the basic communication model, sender, receiver, channel, feedback. And he explains that for every aspect of the communication model, there is kind of a hyperpersonal effect. So let's start with the sender. The sender of information can be more selective in how he or she presents his or herself. So, of course, if you think of your Instagram profile or your Tinder profile or your LinkedIn profile, you do selective self-presentation. You take your best picture on your most professional picture on LinkedIn, you take your most sexy picture on Tinder, you take a professional picture and you use that as your Instagram profile picture. Well, the meme, the Instagram you, the LinkedIn you, the Facebook you, those kind of things. So you selectively present yourself based on how you want to get across in a certain situation. And of course, we always all do that. So we also do that when we're face to face. It's only, it's the editability affordance of social media that we have way more possibilities to present ourselves the way we want online than offline. So you have this selective self-presentation from the sender perspective. From the receiver perspective, there is stereotypical and biased impression formation. And that's basically what psych theory argues. So I present myself in a selective way, and the receiver has only that information to focus on. So if the receiver only knows that I am also part of the social media at work group, then you get a stereotypical impression of me based on what you know of me. Similarly, if the only thing you know is that someone has a very attractive Tinder profile, then you base your whole perception of that person, in first instance at least, on that Tinder profile. So you think this person must be very good looking, must be very handsome, must be very social, very extrovert, etc. So based on the selective information you receive, you form stereotypical impressions. Those stereotypical impressions may be hyper negative, but most of the time people want to come across as, positive or likable or cool or whatever. So most of the time these impressions are hyper positive, but they can go both ways. So that selective self-presentation and then selective impression formation, that's the main process to which we get hyperpersonal effects. But this is exaggerated by the channel, because the channel gives you greater control. You can be more or less visible. You can be more or less, your communication can be more or less persistent. What you type has a high or what you post online has a high degree of editability, etc. So basically, the affordances of social media result in you having greater control over your self-presentation. So the affordances of social media exaggerate those selective self-presentation and selective impression formation effects. And finally, this can result in a feedback loop, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if the only thing you know about me is that I am a good teacher, but nothing else, then you start to behave towards me in a stereotypical way, which as a result may result in me thinking, oh, I must be a very good teacher, and as a result adapting my behavior. And again, as a result, I am actually a good teacher, and you take that into account in your impression, etc. So it's a kind of a positive feedback loop, or negative feedback loop is also possible. So it's similarly what you observe in studies on dating, for example. So if the only thing you know of someone else is that the other person is handsome, you start behaving differently towards that other person, and as a result, that other person starts feeling handsome because he knows that he's or she's being liked, and then he starts behaving accordingly. So that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So basically, hyperpersonal says, well, those four sets of effects. Thank you very much. But that's only because in Zoom you can choose to touch up your appearance. So can you see? Can you? Yeah, let's see. Can you see the settings now? Or is it just a black? Yeah, okay. So touch up my appearance. And I think Zoom incorporated that because Zoom knows that that can have a large effect on how people. So if you have less information, if you see someone buying a webcam, that can affect your impression to a relatively large extent. This should be without. I don't know if it. on, off, on, off. I don't see much difference. The skin gets smoother. Okay. Let's be honest. Let's leave it off. Yeah, or can also be that Zoom just decided to give up. Would also be fun if you just click touch up my appearance and you get a completely different picture. Okay, never mind. So those small cues, let's if you have less information about someone, which is slightly better skin or something like that, can affect what you think about someone as well. So in this, of course, is what you observe in things like Tinder, etc. But can also be relevant for organizations, and also, by the way, for Tinder and for online dating. So in the this I think is more relevant. So in the other paper for last time, they had a kind of an idea that there is a kind of a best way based on social presence and hyperpersonal communication about how much you should communicate. Because if you communicate too little, you may get those social presence effects. So I don't know anything about that other person. I have to talk using computer-mediated communication. So that doesn't really go well. So I don't trust that person. If you have just a bit information about someone else, then all those hyperpersonal effects start playing a role. So if you, for example, I know that the person is, in this case, quick to respond, then those hyperpersonal effects get into play, then you like that person. And the theory says, well, if you then have too much information, then you get a more realistic view of that other person, and then the hyperpersonal effects are gone. So this electronic portrayal continuum idea kind of states that, okay, there is kind of an optimum of information you can present so that you still have some hyperpersonal effects, but you don't have too much information. And you also don't have too little information so that you have just too little information to trust each other. So there's a kind of an optimum. And I am currently trying to do that in my with my thesis students, and hope I can show that a bit. So we are doing a project in which we want to study Tinder conversation. So once people like each other, and then seeing how conversation progresses. And there is kind of the idea that you don't have to, so that you should not meet face to face immediately, but also should not wait too long. And there's a kind of an optimum moment in which you have you still have kind of that hyperpersonal impression, but it's not too much information, and so you have a kind of a best moment to start phone conversations or have an offline date. So that's something we are trying to study now in an online dating context with my thesis students. I don't know if anyone is here for my thesis students, but if you are, then I hope you enjoy the project, and this is also why we do it. So that's my personal theory. I think I can better go to the conclusion, and then we go continue with virtual teams. So basically, if you look at all the computer-mediated communication theories, it's they all have kind of face-to-face as a benchmark. So face-to-face is the richest that we have. And depending on the theory, they say, if you don't have face-to-face, then either it is necessarily worse than face-to-face, or they say, no, people can adopt the situation and can adopt the channel to their needs and form kind of an impression of social identity, such as side argues, or form a kind of idealized impression, such as personal argues, or they just simply use whatever information they have in order to form an impression, which social information processing argues. But also that you see that the effects, of course, depend on aspects of the organization and the task and the team. So if you have to use social media computer-mediated communication in a team with people from all over the place and you don't know them, you will not have a shared identity. You will have relatively little information. So probably that combination is not going to work well for your team. On the other hand, if you already know your team members, or you have a strong sense of identification with the people in your organization, like we talked about last week, then probably you will be able to get along, because if you strongly identify with your team or your organization, will probably result in you having a social identity with the people you have to work with. So the effects of computer-mediated communication and social media vary depending on the task, the content, and the user, of course. So also there's some criticism to give on these theories. So they all have face-to-face as a kind of a benchmark. So they don't really say, actually what you can do with social media is better than face-to-face, because you can have even more information available than you would have face-to-face. Most of the theories as well are developed in the 90s, where computer-mediated communication was mostly text-based, and they cannot always communicate. They cannot always handle, the richer forms of social media interactions we have. So they cannot really explain what happens in video conferencing, for example, which is very similar to face-to-face, but not really. Also, there's no focus on multimodality, so multiple channels at once. So I have a chat, I have video, I can Google you. So what happens when I have all these different types of information available? And those are things we are currently still studying. Still working on these theories and developing them, seeing if we can accommodate them for the current situation, or if we need different theories. And most of all, I think what is most important is that it's just computer-mediated communication and face-to-face, but there's no real attention to the affordances. And therefore, I think that the affordance approach to social media is so useful, because then you can say, okay, it's because of the visibility. It's because you are connected to other people. It's because you can Google someone and the information is persistent. And those features of social media, those cause you to form an impression. Those cause you to be able to edit information about yourself or about your team. So there's no real attention to affordances of social media yet. Let's see if this is useful to discuss now. Yeah, I'll do this after the break. So in sum, before going on a break, if you look at computer-mediated communication affordances and CMC theories, then basically we get a bunch of different affordances that we can work with in social media at work situations. So the social media affordances give us visibility, persistence, adaptability, and associations. And computer-mediated communication gives us more attention to, reduced cues per se, to being able to control, which is similar to adaptability, gives us the sense of presence that we have with certain communication technologies. And what is also not really discussed in the affordances is simply the ability to communicate with each other, using text or audio video, whatever. So if you combine social media affordances and characteristics of computer-mediated communication, I think then you may be able to, to kind of thoroughly investigate and maybe predict to a certain extent how well communication technologies function in organizations. If you take a look at the, okay, in what context do we use computer-mediated communication and social media? Is there are the users similar to each other? Do people already know each other? Is there a shared task, etc.? And those characteristics of organization, of the context, of the task, of the user they interact with, characteristics of social media and of computer-mediated communication, and in turn kind of determine the outcomes of social media use in organizations. And that's what we're going to talk about after the break. So I suggest we have a break for 5 minutes. And we can have a toilet break and have a cup of coffee. And then we continue at like 12 or so. Okay, so see you soon. Okay, I'm back. So let's continue. Can you still hear me? I have some issues with the audio today, it seems. Okay, thanks. Okay, virtual team. So first of all, of course, we will not make it through the entire lecture today because, well, it's me. Unfortunately, next week I have the lecture on knowledge management, and I will continue this lecture and then start with the lecture on knowledge management, which is a bit shorter, fortunately, than the other lectures. What I will do, I don't have time for it today and this week because I have like 20 plus hours of teaching this week. But next week, if we won't make it through the entire lecture, I will just continue talking until I am done, and the rest will be available online. So I don't have to rush through the slides with half an explanation. So for now, we continue with virtual teams, then we take it up next week, and then if I don't manage to finish in time next week, I will just put the remainder of the lecture online. Which is one of the advantages of online teaching, but also one of the disadvantages because it makes sure that I have to be extra more careful about my time management. So, okay, let's start with virtual teams before we end up running out of time even more. So this is what we'll be doing. So we talk a bit about the definition of virtual teams and the pros and cons of virtual teams. And if we have time left, we talk about shared understanding in virtual teams, which relates nicely to social media and aspects of social media. So last week / just now, so we talked about affordances of social media, and we talked about affordances or characteristics of computer-mediated communication. And today we will see how these actually relate to people who have to work with social media in the workplace in virtual teams. So we will see how you can relate those characteristics of social media and CMC to characteristics of team and the task using shared understanding, and what that is I will explain later on. Let's first start with virtual teams. So if you look at the definition of virtual teams, they have all kind of many things in common, but can you just do it? In the chat, could you say what is a characteristic of a virtual team? So what exactly is the virtual part of a virtual team? Physical presence, yeah, physical presence, absolutely, that's one. More? Well, maybe more later, and I'll just start talking. And virtual communication, use of a medium, yeah. So use of certain communication tech. So I think that's the same. Virtual communication, use of a medium is the use of communication technology. They work together on a common goal and a common target. Yes, absolutely. So you're only a team. So that's the definition of team. So it's I think 2 or more people who work together on a common goal. Yeah, it was from different geographical locations. So we already see that there are more aspects to virtual than simply than the word virtual maybe implies at first instance. So a team can be virtual because the people of the team are located in different geographical locations. So if you think of your teams you have to work with for this course, some of you maybe got completely different geographical locations, but I think that other teams are located like, at maximum like 2 or 3 kilometers apart. So they're basically in a similar geographical location. So virtual teams differ in the extent to which team members are on different locations or not. And as a result, but also not as a result. There's also a lack of physical presence. So sometimes teams are co-located, but they don't really see each other. So they do most of the work virtual. So if you look at your own team, so even if you all know each other, even if you all live in Tilburg, or even if you live near the campus, still you will see that maybe you have met each other face to face. Still you see that you do most of the work virtually using communication technology. So virtual is not only physical distance, it's not only use of technology, it's not only geographical location, it's a combination of both, but it's all working on a common goal. So these definitions are, as usually, relatively unreadable, but if you take them apart a bit and see what characteristics they actually mention, it's basically indeed, so it's not constrained to a physical location. It's not constrained to a specific time. So I think we didn't have that one, but of course you can be a virtual team in different time zones, and also everyone can work whenever he or she wants. So because you can communicate asynchronously, so using the chat, using comments in Google Docs, or using a discussion forum in Slack. So you can work on the task separately because it's not constrained to time and location. Then also a team, but we will see that next week in more detail. A team can also vary in composition, so it can also be a bit virtual because depending on who you need for a specific subtask, there are different people part of the team. But always a virtual team is to some extent or fully mediated by technology. So this is kind of a definition of virtual, well, actually a definition of virtuality part of a virtual team. And it's important, therefore, to realize that there are different levels and different dimensions of virtual. So, for example, so these are along 3 dimensions simply because we don't have more dimensions in our physical universe. So it says the percentage of the time apart, the support, the technology support, and the physical distance. And on both of these axes, you can be more or less virtual. So you can be a team which is purely traditional, but you can be like 100% of the time apart, and with a high level of technology support, but with a low level of physical distance, and you're still, to some extent, a virtual team. So in sum, remember that a virtual team is not only mediated by technology, not only physically apart, but it's a combination of those factors. Okay, the next thing is the pros and cons of virtual teams. So there are many pros and cons of virtual teams. And there is a lot of literature about virtual team interaction, and the first paper for this week kind of gives a nice overview of many different subtopics in virtual teams, like trust, geographic location, and distance, etc. All of which can be pros and cons. So let's do them one by one. First, start with the pros. So the advantages of virtual teams are of course, first of all, independent of time and space. So you don't have to fly people to the same location to work together. They're flexible. They can be a flexible setup, and that it's relatively easy to have a diverse team. Different nationalities, different expertise to work on a certain task. Therefore, you have access to knowledge that you would not otherwise have available. For example, if you're a multinational, it's easy you can have a virtual team with people from all around the globe, or maybe even outside experts who are part of the team. It's cheaper because, well, again, you don't have to fly everyone or locate someone for a specific period of time in a separate location. But also the things we talked about, the affordances, that the affordances of social media and the affordances of CMC can accomplish. So like we talked about just before the break. So you can arrange a virtual team in such a way that people identify more with each other, because you can be specific in the extent to which they are visible, and what aspects of them are visible. You can also structure a virtual team so that they are more creative. So if you reduce presence a bit, so that people are not bothered by hierarchical difference, for example, that way you can stimulate equality in a virtual team, and maybe as a result make people more creative in the idea generation stage. So the affordances of social media can work as an advantage to virtual teams. So you can use visibility and presence, etc., in a strategic way to structure a virtual team in such a way that it fits your needs. Now, finally, we have functions of technology, but I will get back to that in 2 slides. The other side of the cons are of the coin are the cons, the disadvantages of virtual teams, and they are given in by the same affordances and characteristics of social media and CMC as the advantages. So, because there is less presence, it may be more difficult to establish trust between team members. On the other hand, you can also stimulate trust by having a shared social identity, for example. So so you cannot say beforehand, okay, with social media, this will be your outcome of your virtual team. So this will work good for a virtual team. It's always a combination of how you incorporate those different affordances. So if you make people more visible, or if you stress the commonality of a virtual team by stressing a social identity, then people may trust each other more in a virtual team. On the other hand, if you have a team which is not present, or with only reduced cues, then it may be more difficult to establish trust. So also what you see is that it's difficult to manage the social process. Communicating information, managing the social part of a virtual team, people liking each other, people talking about stuff other than work to increase commitment and identification, that may be more difficult in a virtual team. And that, for example, may be due to certain hyperpersonal effects. So if the virtual team starts out work-related, then maybe the culture of a virtual team is that it remains very work-related, because that's the information people have when they start the virtual team. All those people are very serious, and that gives kind of a hyper-personal loop that everyone starts behaving serious. That results in a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it will result in kind of a norm in the virtual group of being very, very serious, which is on the one hand a good thing, but on the other hand, if you don't have social talk in a virtual team, will again result in communication issues, lack of trust, and other issues with virtual teams. So again, it's the interaction between the affordances of social media and CMC and aspects of the team. So to continue, so it's often difficult to communicate and coordinate issues in virtual teams. They're sometimes inefficient. Leadership is difficult because it's on the one hand, in a virtual team, it's very difficult to be a what is called a transactional leader, in which you just tell people what they should do, because people just, if they don't do it, you have less control. On the other hand, you have leaders who are more what is called transformational. They are more people-oriented leaders. And that's also difficult to be a leader in such a way, because it's because you have less information, you have fewer social gatherings, so it's more difficult to be a people kind of leader. So leadership is often an issue in virtual team interaction. So what you often see, and maybe some of your groups also have that, there is a kind of an imbalance in the group. So if you have like 2 people from one location and 3 people from another location, you get kind of subgroups that really don't get along. That is more often a problem in virtual teams and non-virtual teams because of those effects of the site model. You have people in one location with a social identity and then people in another location with a social identity, and they don't tend to get along that well. So that can be a disadvantage. And related to that, it's often a bit more difficult to establish common ground. So to establish shared understanding in a virtual team. And what a shared understanding is, I will explain next. So how exactly do we connect virtual teams and how you can make virtual teams a success? So take away the cons and take care of the pros, advantage of virtual teams. So how can you connect those to those affordances of technology? Well, I think a good way to do it is by looking at the functions that technology can fulfill in virtual teams. And that's it's a very old paper, already over 20 years old, who looked at group decision support systems. So systems that people use, that offline teams use in their group work. And they came up with 3 important functions of group support systems. So those are 3 functions that technology can fulfill in teams and also in virtual teams. And those 3 functions are information processing, process structuring, communication support. So first of all, what technology in virtual teams, so for example, social media software in organizations can do, is they offer information processing. So they offer the opportunity to share task-related information. And sharing task-related information is called conveyance of information. So this is all the information you need to do the task. So it's the documents you need, the documents you're working on. So your shared Google Doc you make the assignment in. It's the meeting notes. It's the discussion forum. It's making decisions, information you need to make decisions. So basically all information you need to do the task relates to information processing. The second is process structuring. The technology can, or technology for virtual teams should make it easier to structure the process. Those are things like your Outlook agenda and other more project management software, so which allows you to coordinate the group process. Okay, you are going to work on this, you are going to work on that. If you're done with it, you put it in the system, you tick it off, and then we have a meeting again next Thursday. So things like that. So to coordinate the tasks and to structure the process. So who does what at what time. So basic project management, actually. So the third function of technology in virtual teams is communication support. So this is everything you need to just communicate with each other. So communicate work-related and communicate socially. So the chat, the discussion board, the email, the video conferencing, the WhatsApp groups, everything. And technology can support, usually support these 3 functions. Especially so if you look at social media we have, so enterprise social media like Slack or Clarion, Skype, Yammer, corporate Wikipedias, they all basically offer the same thing. I think this is a good example. No, I'm not going to. I'm not going to show all of this, but do you hear the sound? Nope. Okay. I do. So it's a bit of a creepy guy.
On time and on budget.
But he talks about enterprise.
Lots of companies have tried project management solutions, but they've been disappointed from all the other systems you use to get your job done. But worst of all, they're pretty hard to use. To succeed, I mean change the world succeed. You need an enterprise-grade project management solution that brings you have via email.
So he explains project management and corporate social media software from Clarison. And he explains there are basically three aspects of the software that are used for organizations. First of all, the social, that's the communication part. The second thing is
are tightly linked to the activities and next
the tasks.
Steps that result from those conversations are tightly linked to the end project, the job you need to get done.
So basically, he talks about communication, he talks about management, and he talks about the project. And if you look at the affordances, if you look at the features of Clarison, it all boils down to supporting communication, supporting the project management, and making sure that people can share information and work on the task. Similarly, Slack is a bit more extensive than Clarison, so it has a lot more features. But if you look at the features of Slack, it's also okay. We have communication, we have the projects you're working on, and the draft the document you're working on, and you have a meeting from 1 to 1:30. So every feature that enterprise social media offers also, I think, nicely fits into one of these three different functions of group support systems. So these three are the main, I think, the main functions that support systems can fulfill, and they, if you incorporate these well, these make sure that your virtual team is effective. And so the affordances of social media and computer-mediated communication allow you to do information processing, structuring, communication support. So social media offers the ability to communicate with each other. The visibility allows you to, connect to others and coordinate any associations. Computer-mediated communication offers all kinds of affordances and technologies, etc., for you to process information and communicate. So basically, all these affordances of social media relate, I think, quite nicely to one of the three functions of enterprise social media. And again, most enterprise social media specifically tailor their social media to these three functions of technology and supporting computer-mediated communication. And we continue that next week. And next week, I will explain how specifically those social media affordances can support these three functions, which ultimately results in shared understanding. So a feeling that we can work together as a group and know what we should do as a group. But I think that this is a good place to stop the lecture and continue next week. And again, so next week, next week I will just continue the lecture until it's done, so that I don't have to rush through everything else. Finally, question: if Osiris says the 19th of October, then probably it is the 19th of October. The thing is that we as teachers usually only know long after you do when the exam is. So no one has communicated exam dates to me. Question about the group assignment: should our conceptual model be related to the alternative research question or on their model? I would say that your conceptual model is related to the alternative research question. So it should be related to how you can add to the paper you have chosen. So if you develop an alternative research question, then your model should fit that alternative research question. Okay, well, I'm going to